Thank you, everyone. I am really delighted to be doing this keynote workshop on racial intelligence as a core competency of leadership, and just reflecting on some of the conversation that just happened. I suspect that this keynote will touch on some of the topics that have already been touched upon and raised, and I'm very much looking forward to presenting. So, Jacqueline, if you can do the slide share, we can get started. It's totally fun to see a couple of names that I recognize. Hey, Katie. Hey, Raymond. So nice to see you all here. I'll just start talking. Hey, Octavia. I'm just going to start talking while the slide deck. Okay, there we go. So this is a workshop, really more so than just a keynote presentation on racial intelligence as a core competency. And this is a concept that I have developed over 35 years of social justice nonprofit work. I've been, frontline staff, community organizer, founder and executive director of a couple of organizations. But in all of my work, it's always been in multiracial organizations and all of the kind of complexity that comes with that. For the last 10 or so years, I've been teaching both a fellowship and courses on courageous conversations, which is really how to have difficult and courageous conversations across race, really with the intention of how do we call each other in and do it in ways that are aligned with our justice values. So racial intelligence is a concept that I have been working on. And in this workshop, I'll both present the concept, actually, the next slide, please. The agenda is I'll present the concept. We'll actually do an exercise where people will be in some breakout groups to try this out. And then I would also just love any reflections and feedback from you to hear how the concept landed, what works about it and what doesn't. So with that, the next slide, I'm just going to jump right in. So when I was 13 years old, my family moved from New Delhi, India, to Madison, Wisconsin. So New Delhi was a city of 10 million people, to Madison, Wisconsin, which was a town of about 300,000 people in Midwestern United States, smack dab kind of in the middle part of the country. And, this was the 1980s, bell bottoms, polyester were very popular. And I was a gawky, sort of awkward teenager with thick, long braids, glasses. And I joined a school in 7th grade that was almost all white, except for me, my brother, and 2 other African-American students. And with all of the kind of trauma of migrant transition, one of the kind of interesting experiences that I had again and again in school was that my new classmates would say something to the effect of, "I don't notice that you are different." And when they first started saying this, at the beginning, I thought oh, great, this is I'm being seen as one of them. I have a sense of belonging. They're welcoming me. But after a while, it just became really weird for me because every time they would say it, I would look at them, mostly white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, many of them who had never left the state of Wisconsin. And I would just think to myself, how can we not be different? And ultimately, the thought would sort of float to the top of one of us is crazy here. And I experienced that as a form of this kind of color blindness as a form of racial gaslighting. There were clearly differences. The kind of cultural and pop culture references that I had, the sort of gender expectations that I had grown up with were very different from what I was experiencing in Madison. And yet, and I think this came from a very sort of well-intentioned place of, I don't notice you're different. We're going to pretend that there is no racial differences between us, identity differences, other expectations, and that came also from a position of power of a dominant culture being able to, in some ways, have the privilege of ignoring differences. And this is in some ways the kind of core problem that racial intelligence is trying to address, which is how do we go from colorblindness and in many forms of racial gaslighting, not only in our individual relationships and interpersonal relationships, but also at an organizational level. And oftentimes when organizations take on the task of doing diversity, inclusion, and equity work, belonging, social justice, it is from a recognition that they're white dominant organizations with white dominant culture. And yet this concept of racial intelligence, of awareness of racial differences and how we deal with them and manage them and proactively address them, also happens not only in interpersonal relationships, but at organizational levels. So one of the last organizations that I was the executive director of, the founder and executive director of a reproductive justice organization, we were 75% BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. That was, so it was a truly multiracial organization and there was no majority single race group in the organization. And yet, and this is with somebody who was very committed to diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, awareness of structural inequality. I never took the opportunity in this deeply multiracial organization to have proactive conversations about what kind of different organizational practices we wanted, norms, structures, and expectations. So even within a multiracial context with an awareness of diversity and inclusion, I was as the leader, behaving in colorblind ways where the assumption was that all BIPOC people were similar, and that we didn't need to address the differences in our experiences and in the power relationships that we had within the organization. Next slide, please. So this work really has emerged for me out of the work and study that I have done around emotional intelligence. And as some of my students who are in this know, I love teaching about emotional intelligence. When I first learned about it, it was a little bit like a light bulb went on. I was like, oh, there's a name and a field of sort of inquiry and knowledge about emotional awareness and emotional management, not only for myself and for others. And it was a concept and a framework that really gave me a set of powerful tools. So I have always loved the work around emotional intelligence. And yet, every time I taught it, I was frustrated that emotional intelligence as a field doesn't really address the issues either of race and other intersectional identities. So whether it's around disability or class or gender or sexuality, doesn't really address that. And more importantly, it doesn't address the power relationships that come with those social differences and that social stratification. And so within the field of emotional intelligence, there was kind of this notion that the ways that all emotional responses and all expectations around managing emotions of our, self-regulation and management of others, or managing of social relationships, that it was all sort of, in a sense, a peer relationship. So there were no people who were on the upside of the power dynamics in the context of emotional intelligence, and no people who were on the downside, where more things were expected of some people and less of others. And so racial intelligence really kind of has emerged out of this initial framework of emotional intelligence, of being awareness and management of self and others. And I very intentionally, even though I call this racial intelligence, really looking at it from the perspective of this as a competency, a set of skills, it's a capacity that we can learn and develop, that there are practices that we can use to strengthen our awareness and management as it relates to race. And I also just want to say, very much recognizing that that there are people, particularly BIPOC people, historically colonized people, historically marginalized people who have always had to practice racial intelligence. It's just that we haven't had a name for it. So a part of this project is creating this as a field of understanding and awareness and research and practice, but that just very much recognizing that there are people who have been doing this, there are people who have done this, there are people who are expert at it, and this is standing on the shoulders of many other people who have been deeply engaged in racial intelligence, whether it's in their DEI work, whether it is just for survival's sake. So next slide, please. So the way I have been defining racial intelligence is that it is a social and relational competency related to racial identities and power. So both bringing in this idea of bringing in racial identities and intersectional identities and tying it to power, and how we can build our awareness of those racial and intersectional identity dynamics and the power dynamics, the upsides and the downsides in interactions, in organizations, in institutions and systems, that it is a skill and a capacity for increased awareness, discernment, and agency, and particularly agency in terms of not only self-regulation and management, but just strategizing how we might want to manage a situation, manage a dynamic, proactively strategize around something, a situation, taking race and power into consideration. And ultimately, I think the kind of the real power of racial intelligence is it is a tool to increase our capacity to address racism in our personal, professional, and civic lives. So the more we are able to be aware of racial identities and power dynamics in all of these interactions, the more proactive and agentic that we can be around it. And it is a competency to notice where and how racism shapes our beliefs, our behaviors, and our interests, how we benefit from the system, and how it impacts our actions, the social systems that we create, and the structures. And like I said, it is at the interpersonal, organizational, and systemic levels. Next slide, please. So when I teach my class on courageous conversations, I usually start with defining race and racism and intersectionality. And one of the exercises I do around intersectionality is that I have my students list anywhere between 8 to 12 social identities that are really important to them. They write them on sticky notes, then we all post them up, and then we cluster them. And then based on the cluster, I put them in affinity groups, and these affinity groups meet 4 different times. So each student has an opportunity to be in 4 different affinity groups based on a social identity that was important to them. And in those affinity groups, they answer questions like, what do you like about being a member of this social identity group? What's hard about it? What do you want other people to know about this social identity group? And then what do you hope for the future? And this is really a setup for them to start practicing racial intelligence. And I think about racial intelligence as having sort of 3 kind of moments or practices to it. The first one is to notice and name. So to notice the social identities, racial identities, not only of yourself, but yourself in relationship to others. So the ways in which your racial identities are similar or different, the ways in which your other intersectional identities are similar and different. So it's not only awareness of yourself, it is also acknowledging that in the moment. The second moment is around the meaning and feelings that we attach to those identities and differences. So it is recognizing the stories and the cultural norms around those social identities, the structures and systems, the structures of stratification and inequality that are connected to the difference in racial identity between yourself and the other people, and then any kind of emotional triggers or feelings that you might have around it. And then the third moment is to self-regulate and to manage. So to be aware of how you might get triggered by things, might feel comfortable, sort of a sense of entitled comfort around things, And then decide how you want to manage. So how to respond but not react, how to strategize, and in particular, how to behave in ways that align with your goals. So, those 3 moments. And one of the things that I notice is that when my students, they do these clusterings of social identities, anywhere between half to 2/3 oftentimes don't mention race as one of the important social identities in their 8 to 10 important social identities. For some people, sometimes for white students, there is a lack of awareness, given that white is often the kind of default identity. So even noticing that identity as an identity can be one of the blind spots. And I also notice for many students of color, they just have very conflicted feelings about their identities. Sometimes they have a hard time publicly claiming either the victim or an oppressor identity. Sometimes they just don't feel enough. They don't feel Black enough. They don't feel Indian enough. They don't feel queer enough. Like, there are all of these ways in which we have gotten messages and that we have conflicted feelings about not being enough, not being the right kind, that there is somehow some standard that we have to meet. And all of those sort of conflicted feelings show up in the meaning and feelings moment of racial intelligence. So it's not only just knowing that you have these identities, but it's also the meanings and feelings that you have attached to them. And sometimes we can be there where it's easy to be aware of them, and a lot of times it can also be hard. And in the sort of follow-up conversations that I've had with students, students will talk about, we talk then about the impact of what does it mean when in your 8 to 10 important identities, you either don't mention race, your racial identity, or that these feelings of not enough or not the right kind come up. And the ways in which not mentioning, not noticing and naming can have the impact of either silencing yourself around the importance of that identity, and how it shows up in your life, in your lived experiences, in your interactions, but also how it can also be experienced as silencing of others, where people feel like if it is not mentioned, we sort of like shift into sort of a little bit of a colorblind practice around it. And also that sometimes it can be experienced as being defensive. That this is kind of a third rail issue that cannot be talked about or touched. And in which case, if we can't notice a name, we can't talk about our meanings and feelings or acknowledge the meaning and feelings that we have around it, then we are more likely to be reactive and less likely to be either self-regulate or manage, or just be proactive about how we want our impact to align with our values. Next slide, please. So racial intelligence operates at the individual and interpersonal level. I've already shared a few stories, but I'll share another one where I was at a workshop. This was pre-pandemic time when we were in person, and it was, I had gone to a breakout room at a conference hotel, and it was me and another woman there, and white woman, and we awkwardly started talking in that kind of way of you're trying to get to know each other at a conference. And from her accent, I sort of made an assumption that she was British, and she talked about being from England. And as we were exchanging our stories about where we worked and what we did, after I told her that I worked at the New School, that I had done social justice work for all these years, she very kind of emphatically said, "I want your life." And in that moment, like, I just kind of froze, like my stomach started hurting, and I just had a desire to flee. And so in many ways, I sort of made some excuses and left the room, in part because I felt so uncomfortable in that moment. And I didn't know why. I didn't know why. And I mostly just avoided her for the rest of the conference. And it was only afterwards, when I was telling a friend about this, that I realized that this both reminded me of another incident that I had had at another conference, where I was standing in a buffet line. I introduced myself to the two men who were standing behind me, both of them also from England. And when we said where we were from, and I said I'd grown up in India and my family was from India, he said, well, I'm from the UK, and as a Brit, we British have a great affinity for India and Indians. And once again, I froze. And at that moment, at that point, I had said, I know. And I turned away, because I was like, yes, of course you do, but that's actually not a complimentary thing to say. And in this moment with this woman who said, I want your life, I realized, like, I had some kind of almost a primordial memory of, is this what the British said when they came to India? Now, that was probably not her intention, and there was no way she could do that in that interaction. But if she had had some awareness of what it meant for her to be a British woman, saying something like this to an Indian woman, she might have tried to say something different if, in fact, her intent was to be complimentary, to share some admiration for what I had built for my life. And all of this to say is, oftentimes our lack of racial intelligence or low racial intelligence shows up in that gap between intention and impact. And if we are not able to notice and name the differences between us, any kind of meaning and feeling, the history, the culture that's attached to those differences, then the ways that we impact other people make a big difference. And for my own self, if I had had some more awareness of what my feelings were attached to British people, not necessarily the forefront and with awareness, but like that, these were some of the feelings that got triggered for me, I could have figured out how to respond differently and had taken it as an invitation to friendship, to colleagueship, to collaboration, whatever it could have been. Instead, my reaction was to flee, losing that opportunity. And so racial intelligence operates at individual and interpersonal levels. It is both like the way that we feel internally, but how we react with other people. Next slide, please. And I also just wanted to say racial intelligence is different for white people and for people of color, in large part because of the power dynamics and who is on the upside of these power dynamics and who is on the downside of them. So for white people, oftentimes either white people, and because of the way sort of racial inequality operates, they can operate with a much sort of increased amount of color blindness for many, even people who are deeply committed to racial equity and equality and diversity and inclusion. Many people have been trained in that colorblind approach of, I don't notice. I'm going to pretend that there are no differences between us. And that is somehow a better way to deal with inequity rather than actually dealing with it. And for folks of color, racial intelligence has often been a core survival skill. We are often required, we've had more practice in it, we have trained in it more. Many people, racial intelligence is about reading the room. How many people of color are in the room? Where are the safe places in the room? Who are the safe people? Who are the people who can actually acknowledge difference and behave in ways that are inclusive? And at the same time, for some people of color, for some BIPOC folk, because of the way survival is more oriented around whiteness and white dominant culture, we sometimes also deprioritize our awareness of racial difference between other racial groups. So as a South Asian woman in the United States, I work very hard to be aware of the ways in which racial differences show up between me and particularly Black people and Indigenous people. the ways in which racial dynamics have structured benefits for me in the ways that anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity have cost Black and Indigenous people, and also that I too can be a perpetrator of low racial intelligence or racial insensitivity. So let's see. Yeah, and I'll just share a brief story here, which is one of my dear friends is a Black woman, spent many years in Connecticut. When she moved to New York, decided to go on her own personal hair journey of exploring different hairstyles. She moved from using a weave to trying out a bunch of different hairstyles. And when she began her journey, I remember being super excited. I was like, all right, I can just sort of totally see her in kind of an Anta Davis afro. And luckily for me, before I said anything, I caught myself and I said, wait a minute, what am I? Why do I feel entitled to have an opinion about what a Black woman should do about her hair and her body? And the subtle ways in which the racism and anti-Blackness have, allowed me to think that that is an appropriate thing to do. And so by being able to notice and name the differences between me and one of my dearest friends, and the meanings attached to that expression of preference, I was able to self-regulate a little and manage in ways that were important to our friendship, and that hopefully allowed her to feel seen more as a Black woman and not just as me pretending that we were equal or peers in this relationship. I don't know if peers is the right word, but anyway, so another story. Next slide, please. This racial intelligence is also intersectional. So even though I am calling it racial intelligence, and I say this in my class, which is there is no human body that has a racial identity, but that does not have a gender, class, ability, age, sexuality, nationality, all of those identities. We all have multiple identities. Race intersects and often is, at least in the United States, and in many situations is the primary identity that is the most visible identity. And so I talk about racial intelligence as racial and other intersectional identities, but given how race is such a third rail in the United States, it is both the most prevalent and ubiquitous of identities in terms of social stratification, and oftentimes the least talked about, although in this political moment that has been changing in many ways. So recognizing that racial intelligence is always intersectional is an important part of this. I can imagine that there are ways in which racial intelligence, one could also talk about gender intelligence or class intelligence or sexuality or disability intelligence are other forms, but wanting to start really with racial intelligence, hopefully as kind of a linchpin concept that can lever rich discussions and changes in behavior in a whole other range of things. Next slide, please. Also wanted to just say that racial intelligence not only is individual and interpersonal, but it also happens at the level of groups and teams. And this is where leadership really does matter and is part of as a management practice, that leaders in groups and groups themselves can operate either with high or low levels of racial intelligence, sort of the capacity to notice and name racial and intersectional differences in a group, what kind of expectations and practices and stereotypes and blind spots operate with those groups. That particularly as leaders, that we be aware not only of our own racial identities and the racial identities of everybody else in their team and group, but then how do we choose to make sure that we are behaving in ways that are inclusive of the many different identities, and making sure that nobody feels on the margins or marginalized in their group. Next slide. And also, racial intelligence operates at the level of organizations and institutions. And here, some of you might have heard the story of the new school and the recent part-time faculty labor strike that happened at the end of last semester. It was a very contentious strike with a lot of great activism on the picket line. It was a great opportunity for people to be, particularly faculty and students, to be in solidarity fighting for something that was important to them. And from a racial intelligence perspective, there was a pretty high level of color blindness that happened during that strike, where there was very little acknowledgement that the president, the provost, and the senior leadership of the new school was primarily Black. And so in many ways, some of the critiques and the language that was leveled at the leadership and the administration was both colorblind and in some ways actively racist. So sometimes there were claims that the leadership, and even though people talked about the leadership being incompetent, that they were behaving in ways that were dishonest and deceptive, that they were underqualified for their positions, and that sometimes that they had kind of nefarious or malicious intent in the ways in which they dealt with the strike. Now, if we had had the racial intelligence to recognize that when you say leadership is incompetent, it means something different, it lands differently when it is primarily Black leadership. It doesn't mean that we cannot critique the practices, the policies, the strategy, that we can't be in principled disagreement about actions and strategies. But once we start talking about leadership being incompetent or nefarious, et cetera. And so when the kind of colorblind and racist language was called out, there was also an equally strong reaction. Some people of color didn't feel included in the call out of the use of racist language. Others felt that it meant that we were not able to critique and give feedback to leadership, all which makes it very complicated. But even an organization that is socially justice oriented can and has social justice as a core practice, racial intelligence is something that we have to acknowledge and practice together to increase the capacity of an organization to hold conflict, and to hold conflict in a way that does not reinforce either stereotypes or norms or just the way in which systemic racism operates in within our organizations and institutions. And next slide, please. So I just want to end the kind of presentation on the concept of racial intelligence, which is to talk about it as a core competency of leadership, particularly in multiracial organizations, that as leaders and as followers in multiracial organizations, we need to be aware of racial differences, of intersectional differences, be able to notice and name them within our groups and our teams and our organizations, identify the ways in which the meanings that are attached to them, what we consciously and unconsciously hold, perceptions that we hold about them, and then get skillful with managing. And I can imagine that racial intelligence is going to be an important concept to be used in diversity, inclusion, and equity trainings and organizational change processes. But I wanted to just give you one final example of a moment of feedback. So in my last organization, one of the things that we did, it was every 3 months, we had a 4-day retreat for fellows that in the reproductive justice movement. They came from around the country. And these fellowships were for social movement leaders and activists to learn innovation and practices around calling in as opposed to calling out. And our fellowship manager was a Black woman from St. Louis, She was great at managing all the logistics, the recruiting, the, sort of building the individual, like one-on-one relationships with the fellows, and created a great pipeline and onboarding for the fellows. And yet when we were at the retreat, there were several times that I noticed that she looked very kind of shut down and unhappy. So after the retreat, after our first retreat, I met with her to give her some feedback. And when I raised the issue, I said, and I named 2 or 3 different moments where I noticed that she looked kind of withdrawn. And I asked her what was going on. And her response was, she said that was just her resting face. And in that moment, I was very aware of myself as a South Asian woman, as her boss, giving feedback to this Black woman who was also mid-career, and also all of the kind of the racialized implications of resting face and its kind of possible references to resting bitch face, to the ways in which racist stereotypes stereotype Black women, both as angry Black women, but also as caretakers and mammies, and the level kind of cheerfulness and caretaking that is required of them. And so in that moment, I was able to use some of my racial intelligence and shift from giving her evaluative feedback about how I thought she showed up to more coaching feedback. And we just had a really good conversation about, if this is her resting face, and it might not impact everybody in the same way, what were ways in which she could behave that would communicate warmth and enthusiasm and welcome to the fellows, while still being authentic to who she was, and not feeling that she had to bring on this weight of a set of racist stereotypes. So that's just one example and way in which sort of racial intelligence can be a really important skill in management, in supervision. I know earlier somebody referenced a book on identity conscious supervision. In some ways, racial intelligence is a tool very much for that. So with that, next slide, have a few minutes for Q&A. So I would love to, if people have any questions, and if you will do this for a few minutes, and then we're going to go into some breakout rooms, and I'll give I'll give the directions for that in a minute. But so, any questions?
So Sujatha, I just want to say you're amazing. We really appreciate having you on the faculty here. I'm Mary Watson, Dean of the College, and really excited about the work that you're doing in your presentation. I want to ask you a question about whiteness. And I want to say that, I have been doing some racial justice work on whiteness for about a decade with an organization called the Privilege Institute. I'll put the link in the chat that folks can look at. And one of the things they do is they run annually what they call a white privilege conference, which is about understanding and dismantling white dominance. So there are lots of books written about white fragility and about the perils and challenges of whiteness. And one of the things we do in that conference is at the end of each day, we run separate caucus or processing groups. And the ones that I have been running for the last 8 or 9 years are groups of whites talking about how their own whiteness has showed up. My own whiteness just showed up because I was the first to speak. So I just want to name that. So what do you think about whiteness, and how does this fit into your model?
So racial intelligence is relational. So the kind of awareness we need to have. So I'll just, since you talked about whiteness, the awareness of race between 2 white people can be different between, say, you and me, Mary, right? And so how much are you aware of my racial identity, and how much am I aware of your identity? And then what are the meanings and feelings that I attach to it and you attach to it, right? So oftentimes, particularly in workplaces, I think white people do have an expectation of solidarity, of protection from other white people, so that there might not be held to the same standards. And that the flip side of it, which is higher expectations of people of color or being held to different standards. And then the question is like, what do you want to do with it? So if you don't acknowledge it, if you don't notice it, and not only notice it for yourself, but to name it in the dynamic between you, then you don't do anything about it. And it goes back to practices of either color blindness or racial gaslighting, where you're pretending that there isn't a difference, that we don't have different lived experiences and different expectations and different burdens. And then we're just going to pretend like that didn't happen. So I don't think that racial intelligence is in any way, like I said before, it is not something new. We have all been doing it, but if we have the language to be a little bit more precise and disciplined about it, I think it can actually move us forward faster in terms of what we hope to accomplish.
Thanks so much.
Any other? All right. Well, if there isn't, I am going to give you all a little experience of working with racial intelligence. Jackie, if you can put the slide deck back up. So we're going to do a little exercise in belonging and feedback. Next slide. So you're going to start out with 5 minutes. You're going to journal. And there's going to be, I'll show you the list of questions. And they're really questions, you're going to journal on questions of belonging. And then we're going to put you in, I'm trying to think, we're going to put you into breakout groups. And there's just going to be 2 people in each group. And you're going to use a timer and just share, each of you is going to share your answers to the questions around belonging. You get 5 minutes each. I strongly suggest you use a timer because time is one of those places where racial intelligence can sometimes be a little low in terms of who takes up more time. And then after you do that, after you share, you're going to spend 5 minutes journaling about feedback, and I'll give you the questions around feedback. So you're going to do 2 rounds of this. The first round, you're going to do an alpha order by first name. So whoever's first name is earlier in the alphabet, that person goes first. The second round, you'll go by alpha order by last name. Next slide, please. And the journal questions and the questions for the pair share are, where do you feel like you belong? And these are places that feel like home. And who are your people? Who are the people that you feel that you belong with? What gives you purpose in your work and life? What makes your heart sing? What do you want others to know about you? And some important moments in your own personal history. You only have 5 minutes for it. So in a 5 minutes journal, then 5 minutes in the pair share. And then let's see. And in the second journaling, so after you do the pair share, the next slide, please. You're just going to do, and these are 2 different questions. So the first round is, how might you prepare to receive feedback from the person in your pair share, right? So this is preparing yourself to receive feedback. And what do you notice and name about them and their racial identities? What do you notice and name about you in relationship to them in your racial identity? And how might that impact feedback? The meaning and feelings that you attach to it, and then ways that you might regulate and manage. So, and then the second round, you're going to be, how might you prepare to offer feedback to this person? So that's that's the exercise. And Jackie's going to put you into dyads, 2 people per. You're going to have 15 minutes total in this. So it's a little bit tight. So we're going to start out with the 5 minutes of journaling, and then Jackie will put you into the dyads. Any questions? And sorry, one last thing is you're going to move directly from your first dyad, your first round, to your second round. And we'll leave this question, the slide up. Any questions about previous slide, Jackie.
I think I might need to end the share for a second.
Okay, that's fine. Any questions about the exercise? Nope. All right. Okay, so we're going to spend 5 minutes now just journaling on these questions. Oftentimes, we think that we are communicating both positive and critical feedback implicitly, right? So in the ways that we behave. And if we are able to kind of notice and name differences, we can't always assume that what is an implicit communication on our part, like disapproval, for example, of what a coworker is doing, is actually received in the same way. And so I think this is also another place where racial intelligence can help us, where, or sometimes when, and I said, one of my experiences has been oftentimes when I am one of the few women of color in predominantly white spaces, I have to very much watch my facial expressions because I often get read as being unhappy or angry or upset about what the conversation is, which is not my intent. And I also, when I'm not noticing the racial dynamics, I don't expect to be read in those ways. And so the difference between intention and impact can matter. Yeah. Michelle, and then I know Octavia, you had your hand up. So, but thank you, Katie. Yeah. Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, Sujatha. Thank you so much for this keynote and workshop. I had a lovely, I think it was, who was I speaking with? Was it Celine? Or now I'm forgetting the name. Hello, where's my partner? This is embarrassing. We had a wonderful conversation. The things that come up for me was, we talked about the assumptions that people make about each other because of their how they present, in different ways. And he asked me, are you a New Yorker? Are you Jewish? So my name, my voice, whatever, my affect. And then he asked me, how do I feel about the, being asked that, and I said, I'm fine with that. Right. But I have come to be very careful about, making assumptions about people when I ask about them. And he recounted that similarly, he's experienced that too, where he's made assumptions about someone. Are you from the Middle East, or where, or not even that, even just asking where someone is from when they are a person of color can be offensive, right? So so those were the kinds of conversations we had, and I shared that, that I'm thinking about in my upcoming class, that to, as we start off getting to know each other, rather than asking people where are they from, right, saying, where is what you call home, and think of it, home, as being, it could be multiple things, right? So I've been working through how to even explore getting to know each other, right? And so that's one reflection. And then I have one more quick reflection, which is a more maybe complex one, but that we won't interrogate, we probably won't talk about right now, but is that I am really struck in my time at the New School, how I feel I have felt as someone who presents as a white woman, apparently as a New Yorker and as a Jew as well, according to my last conversation, that the assumptions that people make about me, right, and the lack of interest in finding out more about who I am, right? So there are so many faculty meetings, there's so many other meetings, mixed group meetings, whatever, where we don't know each other and we don't seek to learn about each other. I mean, Sujatha, I know you, I know Latha, we talk. It's a different kind of thing. There's relationships we all have. But in those more committee-like or even classroom-like, whatever it is, we really don't know each other and we make assumptions. And I'm struck profoundly and sad about that. So.
Yeah. Well, so two things to your comments, and thank you, Michelle. So one thing, and I think this is actually a great example, this question of where are you from? And I will say that when white people ask that question, it lands very differently than when people of color ask that question, right? And that tells you something about the power differential and what the question is trying to do, what it does socially in terms of categorizing. So, it's just an example.
Right.
And to your second point, which is like, we don't really get to know each other. And so I do think racially intelligent organizations need to make the space for people to get to know each other so we don't make assumptions. So whether it is, some kind of check-in question that really reveals something about our personal lives, I think that's important. Usually in my class, the start of the semester, I'll have my students do 4 rounds of get to know you questions where they're answering those journal questions, in part because we find that we tell different stories each time we answer those questions. Like my answer to where is home today will be different. It might be different than it is from where it is tomorrow. Right. And not just because I'm in a different place, but because that's what I am, that's my zeitgeist for the day. But in order to be racially intelligent organizations and to build those relationships, we need to be asking each other these questions, to get curious, to not make assumptions. Because I think the colorblind approach, it just reifies the assumptions that we make. It keeps them hidden and unconscious as opposed to aware and conscious. And so the more we create spaces to get to know each other, it really matters. And I really do think, like, to your point, which is like, for the New School, if we make the commitment to being a racially intelligent organization, how do we start every committee meeting with a dyad where 2 people, like, it doesn't even have to be everybody, but every time you have a faculty meeting, you're in a room with 2, somebody else that you're getting to know a little differently, right? And which is what we used to do when we were in person, right? We had more opportunities to chat, but so how do we build in those spaces virtually also, I think really does matter.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other sort of questions? Kate.
Hello, everyone. I'm sitting in Nairobi, Kenya. So recently I came from a training and I got to mingle with my colleagues. It was in New York. And they were using the term social identities. How, instead of asking where you're from, so they were using social identities. How do you want to be identified on the social side? And it could be something given or chosen. Now, I am always proud, without asking, that I am from Kenya. I'm a Kenyan. I'm in Africa, Nairobi, Kenya. I'm a Black woman. Now, learning from responses from my other colleagues, because, we embrace the diversity, equity, inclusivity aspect. Sometimes it's even how you say it, because I can use a timid voice, I'm from Kenya, I'm an African, I'm a Black woman. Well, I'm proud to be a Kenyan. I'm proud to be Black. I am from Africa. So the tonation of your voice and how you say it. So that will either make you welcome me into your space and I can read your body language, or, pull me back and say, thank you for identifying yourself, but, pull back, take it calmly. But then it's that boldness that we bring out, first, I'm Black, I am a woman. I want to be identified as, you can add something now, something that is not given, either on your social or personal life or work life, I'm a sunshine yellow. I am a mother, such aspects when you start to social identify yourself. Instead of someone asking you, where are you from? Obviously, I'm Black. So now you wouldn't have known unless I told you, everyone here, that I am in Nairobi, in Kenya, and obviously that's in Africa. Yeah, and as the first, one of the colleagues just said, yes, when someone speaks, as I speak, you're all listening. So that gives me, you're paying attention to what I'm saying. Again, it's how we communicate. I didn't have a partner. I had a partner, but there was no communication, but I had my notes. Thanks, Sujatha and everyone else.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for sharing, Kate. And I think, what you bring up are two really important points, which is one, our social identity is both how we identify ourselves, but it is also how we are identified as by others, right? So what you said, it's like, it's obvious that you're a Black woman, might not be obvious just visually that you are from Kenya or that you are in Africa, right? Or you're African. And those differences actually really matter. In terms of understanding the social identity relationships and the power relationships between us. So another example that I'll give is one of the things that I'm often aware of with my South Asian friends and Indian friends is, and this is a social difference that to me is not always, it's not always relevant, but there are often caste differences between us. And it is only people within our own group that are aware of those caste differences and the meaning that's attached to it, the feelings that we have attached to it, how historically marginalized or included or at the center we feel based on our caste experiences and differences. And I imagine that there are all kinds of social differences in Kenya and in Africa that very much matter. So when a Kenyan is speaking to a Ugandan, it matters. I spent some time in South Africa, so, and it's also, when it's white Afrikaans, and so, like all of those things matter, and it requires us to be incredibly nimble and aware and get to know each other, really making those personal connections, but not pretending as if these social identities and power differences don't matter. So it is really like embracing them, not embracing them in the like, let's continue them, but embracing our awareness of them. Thank you, Kate. Octavia.
I'll keep this quick because I know we're almost out of time. But first off, I just want to say I felt like I was back in the classroom with you, Dr. J, and I am very happy to be here. So thank you. I feel like right. If you ever have an opportunity to take class, Dr. J, do it. I think I was paired with Jody, and one of the things I just wanted to flag, particularly in going back to Mary's question about whiteness, is because this was we had a conversation. We probably didn't do the exercise exactly the way we were supposed to, which also feels very like that was always the case. But we did the sharing, and then we had a conversation, and I had to because I was paired with another white woman and we're talking about racial intelligence here, I had to be very conscious about reflecting on that particular topic in the conversation, making sure that I was bringing my consciousness around whiteness. And I was one of the people who identified as white in the Post-it note exercise, but still having to be very conscientious about bringing that both into my own sharing and into our continued conversation, because it's so easy to just let that go when you're talking to somebody else who identifies in the same way. But or appears to identify. It might not even be like, you know, if I'm thinking about a lot of people who you just make an assumption about, once again, from a social identity standpoint. And the ways in which actually bringing it into the conversation can be really, really valuable and helpful in unpacking our own, what we have inherently in ourselves or has been given to us by society.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Octavia. And I think this is also another really important point, which is, and this is why I've created, in a sense, these 3 moments in racial intelligence, which is like noticing and naming is the beginning, right? So it's the awareness, the attention that we bring to it. But the second part is the meanings and feelings that are attached to it, right? So the ways in which we might feel conflicted about it, the ways in which it feels awkward to sometimes publicly name it, right? Like sometimes it feels like you're being socially inappropriate. And I imagine mostly around whiteness, that is even more so, that it feels socially inappropriate to name whiteness in relationships with white people. And the third, and this is, I think, ultimately the really important point is like, how do we self-regulate and manage around it, right? So, the intentionality that you brought to like, how do I stay on topic here, that there is some regulation. And sometimes, there is ways in which we can perform the naming and the noticing, right? Like I'm claiming my whiteness, and then that forgives the other 2 parts of it, which is then understanding what's attached to it and then doing something differently, right? And this is the big part around this, which is like the purpose of the tool is to do something different than what you either habitually did or what is expected of you, or what is the norm. So how do you do something differently? How do you engage differently? How do you create space differently? How do you include people differently? So it's not just the naming and awareness, but it is the do something different. So, all of that is just equally important. And with that, the last 2 minutes, so I'll just say 2 last things. And I didn't talk about this before, but I think there's been a lot of interest in implicit bias training. And one of my frustrations with that is that when we talk about it as implicit, in that framework, there's no way to bring it into being explicit, right? And explicit in the ways of how do we change how we behave and think in our awareness. And I do think that racial intelligence is a way for us to be explicit in being able to measure our own racial intelligence, like how can we improve it? How can we improve it in relationship to different people? I'm always on a journey around interrogating my own anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, my own colorism, right? So how am I constantly doing that? And to develop some very specific practices around it, not only at my individual level, but the organizational level. So how can I improve my capacity to notice and name and include and manage and regulate for more inclusion, for more equity, for more sense of belonging? And then lastly, I workshopped this concept at a seminar a little while ago, and one of the pieces of feedback that I got was one of the things that a person appreciated about this is that racial intelligence really offers a space of possibility. And to think about racial intelligence not as like you're either good or bad at it, but that this is a space of possibility to do things differently in alignment with our values. So to bring awareness and intentionality to it, to lean into that space of possibility. So with that, I thank you all very, very much. It has been a pleasure. Please feel free to reach out. I'd love any other feedback and any other reflections. So thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you very much, Sujatha, for such a thoughtful and insightful presentation and workshop and facilitation following that. And I'm sure that this is going to be an incredible book that I cannot wait to read. And of course, as the chair of your program, to take that in and make it into a 3-day workshop or something. So, as part of a new program that we are trying to build. So this is wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we look forward